bigger crowd than this one. But I think that the conversation that we are about to have is a very important conversation. It's recentering the East, thinking about how we can, and obviously beginning with why should we uh, uh, recenter the East as for our conversations, for our well-being, for our own futures, both literary as well as otherwise. Existential, I think, but we'll get to that. Um, let me also let me begin by saying that I was one of my name is mentioned on the advisory board of this conclave. I was one of the people who helped draft the statement for the vision for this festival, and I'll read out what we have written. The Indus Conclave envisions a thriving global South, one that draws on the strength of its histories, centers its own voices, and advances bold, scientific, and community driven solutions to the shared challenges of the future. From its historic gathering place in Lahore, the conclave serves as a conduit for fostering South South solidarity and recentering the narratives, histories, and geographies of the global majority. Um, in other words, if I think that vision was to be embodied in a particular individual, I would unhesitatingly think of Eden Koo, who we are very very fortunate to have with us here. Eden wears many hats. He does many many things. He's a journalist. He's a poet. He's a translator. He is the founder of Posaka, a cultural organization that works with Malaysia's master performers of tradition and ritual, shamans, shadow puppeteers, ritual dancers, and a publishing house, Kala, which translates global voices into Malay. For his work, he has been named Asian of the Year by Singapore's News Asia in 2016. Uh, he is also a jazz musician. He's a vocalist for the ensemble Michael Veerapan Jazz Trio, and but most wonderfully, he describes himself as an intellectual bandit, rogue. And I think that description encapsulates a lot of what Eden has done, what Eden continues to do, and I think it's very much in the spirit of his work, and I think informs the ethos of his stance on the world. So that is Eden. The reason why I think we need, so this conversation about recentering the East, the reason why we need to center it so much on learning about Eden and learning about his work and learning about how he came to do the kind of work that he's done with Pusaka, with Kala Publishing House, with the kind of journalism that he does, with the kind of translation and literary output that he's had. The reason why we need to learn about that is so that that can serve as a model for these conversations, these connections of that we are looking to build in the East, in South South, which again, as I'm saying, which is the raison d'être of this festival as a whole. So absolutely delighted for you to be here. Eden's first talk yesterday was on 50 years of Muhammad Ali's fight Thrilla in Manila, and Eden has spent a lot of time traveling around Southeast Asia, speaking to sports journalists, speaking to people who were in that fight. And but I think again, Eden being Eden, he's really situated that fight much more symbolically, much more philosophically in the larger context, in the many contexts. So third world is one context, the kind of political regimes and the kind of political moment that we were in the 60s, 70s. So and I think that the place where we left that conversation, Eden, was actually drawing full circle back to your adolescence, and you basically told us that you were a very violent child, or a very violent adolescent, and you had gotten down to a science how to break someone's teeth with a punch. So let's begin there. How do you see your journey from there to becoming the journalist that you did, and then we will talk about how that translated into Pusaka and the work that you did there.
Um, Thank you, Bilal. Always very generous. And thank you all for being here on a Sunday afternoon to listen to some Malaysian guy come and tell his story. Yeah, well, I'm very interested in very primordial things. And I didn't go through a long period of violence, but I went through a period of adolescent violence, which I think had a certain kind of justification. I come from a country that is very defined by ethnicity and race. Even our politics is defined that way. According to, we have race-based parties. We're coming out of that now with multiracial parties, but overall, that still dominates
Right.
the discourse. I come from a mixed marriage. My father is Chinese and my mother is Indian, in a just slightly predominantly Malay-Muslim country. My parents are Buddhists and Hindus. And I grew up as a mongrel child. And in very ethnically conscious Malaysia, you're constantly reminded that you're a mongrel. The words are not so kind. They're kind of like paria and, bastard, which was very traumatic. And I was a bamboo of a child, in Malay, you say you're an ikan bilis, an anchovy, very thin, very scrawny, and I was very bullied in school, name called and things like that. And then I went into secondary school, and I spoke of this at the last session, but I got into a fight, and normally I would back down, but in this particular instance, I didn't back down. And I landed a punch on someone, quite a big, hefty guy, and well known for having a gangster reputation in school. But I was quite fearless at the moment and threw this punch, and he flew right across the room. And another thing I discovered in that incident was that I felt no pain. So people could hit me, and I felt no pain. And so I got my revenge for the next 3 or 4 years, just beating everyone I could. And got I was expelled from school, and I went into reform school, and I began to get involved in gangs and things, and my expertise was breaking people's teeth. Something I'm writing about now, and I can tell you exactly where to hit to break the teeth, and how the person's body would react and convulse, right? And my editor, who's an elderly woman, was so excited about all this and asking me to write it in great detail, how blood spits and things like that. But that all changed after a few years as I was dragged more and more into the world of femininity or women. I got to interact with women a lot more. I grew up with women in my extended family, cousins and aunts, and we were a very expressive family. We kissed and hugged each other a lot. And then I went to a boys' school, which was very traumatic for me. But then I grew out of all this kind of adolescent violence by realizing that, if you wanted to fall in love with a woman, you don't brandish machismo. It's not sexy, But if you were a poet and you could play the guitar and you could be intense that way, you were pretty popular.
Right.
Um, but yeah, I mean, intellectual life, the life of literature, the life of culture, which I'd always kind of grown up in it, but to take it very seriously, immerse myself in it, and I think a lot of how I've navigated life since then has been literary and cultural and musical, and that has never ended, right? Because it's so seductive. But now I go back. I turned 55 last year. I'll be 56 on October the 14th. Now I reflect a lot on what that actually means, and it does give me a sense that I come from a very chaotic kind of culture, and I think I carry a lot of chaos in me, and I think a lot of the world does, but they have a choice. I don't have a choice,
Right.
and so I need to write about it. Yeah.
Right. And so the journalism that you did was really a kind of a survival strategy. Can we say that, or was it a reform strategy, or was it something that helped you? In what way? I mean, so what I'm trying to get at is that journalism helped you relate to the world in a particular way. How do you reflect on that?
Well, I'm a very political person.
Right.
I went to study in the UK. In 1989, I entered university in Newcastle upon
Right.
Tyne
Right.
to do Islamic philosophy. That's been my first
Wow.
degree. At a very, very interesting time. So it was the time of the Rushdie affair, the publication of the Satanic Verses, which had great resonances to Malaysian society, of course. And Malaysia was also becoming increasingly aware of its religiosity. And then I landed in the UK, and 3 months later, the one thing that had shaped so much of the world came tumbling down, which was the Berlin Wall.
Berlin Wall, yeah.
And I traveled through Eastern Europe at that time. I was very fortunate to be in Prague Square when Václav Havel was released,
Wow.
and I waved to him.
Wow.
I traveled through East Germany, through Hungary, and to a country that has become one of my intellectual homelands, Poland.
Wow.
I love Polish writers, and I pronounce Polish names very well.
How is Zbigniew Herbert? pronounced?
Zbigniew Herbert,
Zbigniew.
Herbert, yeah.
Oh, Herbert. Okay.
And Czesław Miłosz, and people like that. So this sense of everything borderless
Right.
coming down with that wall, I think had great resonances. But I'm a very political person. I'm deeply involved in politics. Have been for a very long time. I returned home to Malaysia at a very politically gravitational period. I'm actually writing a political biography at the moment of
Right.
our long-time Prime Minister, Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, who just turned 100 in July.
Wow.
So I think a lot of my journalism, but my journalism is not specific. So even in journalism, I'm very sprawling.
Yeah.
And what I try to do is really not segment anything. I think everything in life is political, and politics is also very cultural. So it is to try and illuminate. We have created too many boundaries for ourselves, which is very reflective of the way, for example, the state would like you to behave in very categorical ways that you are this and you are that. As a child, as a mongrel child, as a child of mixed marriage, well, I don't have a choice.
Right.
And where do I put myself?
Right.
And from a very young age, I can't remember what this poem is, but it was read by an actor I really loved called by the name of Richard Burton. And it ends with just the lines, and to hear the calling of the world, the world. And that has been very much something I've been seduced by.
To hear the calling of the world, the
The
world,
world, the world.
the world, the world. Right.
Worldliness.
Right.
In Malay, you have a beautiful word for that, dunyawi.
We also have the same
Yeah,
word.
dunya is, of course,
Yeah.
the world,
Yeah.
but to be dunyawi,
Is-
of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or worldly.
Or worldly, yes.
Right. Yeah. So you went on. So you started doing your journalism at 23. So Eden has had the honor of, or I don't know, or dubious honor of having interviewed at least three Pakistani premiers, including Benazir Bhutto, Nawaz Sharif, and Pervez Musharraf. So Eden, so then you went on to start Pusaka. Tell us about Pusaka. Tell us about the kind of problems you were trying to solve. And again, I would like you to kind of link it to your biography as well. Of where were you at that time? Just and what in you wanted an organization like Pusaka.
Yeah, we can. And before that, since we are in Pakistan and I'm an outsider, do you want to hear descriptions of each of your prime ministers and what they would like to be interviewed? Benazir was incredibly dramatic, very, very attractive, but full of flair and incredible gestures. And Nawaz Sharif was very crafty and very calculated in everything he said. But I must say that one of the finest interviews I ever had was with Pervez Musharraf,
Right.
an incredibly intelligent, intense, and well, at that time anyway, quite visionary leader.
Right. Right.
Yeah. But back to Pusaka. When I returned home, I was very interested in the Salman Rushdie affair because it happened right at the time of global Islamic revivalism, which had been there, of course, for a very long time, even predating the Iranian Revolution. Yeah, but by the 80s, as a reaction to, I think, things that had happened in Iran, the Sunni world, from which I came, of course, got into a bit of a panic because Khomeiniism began to get very popular. So our present Prime Minister, Anwar Ibrahim, who was a very well-known Muslim leader at that time, within 2 weeks of Khomeini's returning to Tehran, he was summoned and given an audience with the Imam. And I think what that did was it gave a sense of panic to the Sunni world. And it drew out Saudi Arabia from its enclosure into essentially exporting a lot of its ideology or its sense of religiosity to the rest of the world, which culminated, of course, in what happened in Afghanistan in 1980. So this had tremendous effect in a country like Malaysia, which at one time had a very kind of localized sense of Islam.
Right.
Very, very rooted in tasawwuf, in Sufism, very syncretic. And by the 1980s, all that changed. Somehow Muslims were not supposed to live that way anymore,
Right.
but a lot more according to hukum and shariat and so on, yeah? And then, of course, you had the great exportation of students into centers of learning all over the Muslim world. Two places like Saudi Arabia, not just Al-Azhar in Egypt, where they all used to go,
Yeah.
but to the peripheral places,
Yes.
Jordan and Yemen and places like that. And of course, they came back carrying a lot of these experiences.
Yeah.
And that led to the transformation of Malay Muslim society. And what that transformation meant was that there were many things contained in the Malay Muslim body, embodied in them, that was no longer halal, no longer permissible. And these included many religious practices, but these included also many cultural practices. For example, the art of shadow puppetry. The art of shadow puppetry has at the core of its performance the Ramayana, yeah, in a Muslim society. Except that there are so many changes and transformations that take place that the Indian Ramayana is hardly represented in the Malay Ramayana. In fact, in the Malay Ramayana, it's not even called the Ramayana. It's called the story of Ravana.
Oh, right.
Okay,
It's
so
flipped.
highly secularized.
Right.
But that these things didn't seem to matter to the new people who wanted all of these things changed.
Right.
We have another tradition that we work with called the Mak Yong, and it's basically a form of therapeutic healing theater that revolves around gender fluidity. So men play women's roles and women play men's roles and things like that. All of these things were then kind of proscribed
Right.
or frowned upon. Proscribed by the home of these traditions, which had been taken over by the Islamic Party, and then frowned upon by the more central authorities.
Right.
So I began to be very interested, essentially, with what happens with this kind to communities when cultural dislocation of this kind happens.
Right.
Right. I was also, of course, had a literary interest, which is poetics.
Yeah.
What is the language of ritual?
Right.
What is it in language or particular patterns of speech that can restitute somebody, for example, right? What is the interest? What is the appeal or the power of incantation or mantras, as they call it in Malay? We say mantara, which is mantra. But these things were all now forbidden, right? So on various angles, I never wanted to start an organization. I first ventured in there to look at the politics of what was happening
As a journalist.
as a journalist,
Right.
the reimagining of the self, and also what were the power relations? Why was culture like this? What would happen to a community sense of memory? All these things were very, very important things to me. They're all coming out in a book soon to happen. But no, I never planned to set up an organization. I have absolutely no discipline that way, and all my work was that of an intellectual bandit and a pirate and an
Right.
interloper and a subversive. But we were able to carry on and ensure the viability of these traditions because community support was very strong.
Right.
And I have invested a lot of my faith in communities, in
Right.
how communities hold on to their traditions and uphold the traditions. The idea of setting up an institution was forced upon me, imposed upon me by my adopted father, who's a very marvelous, very well-known shadow puppeteer, now passed, of course.
Oh wow.
But he imposed, I don't know whether that was a bequest or a curse. It's been now, the organization is close to 25 years.
Wow. Wow. So you were trying to solve this problem of, and I think that what you say about whatever is embodied, like there are things that are present in the you are describing it as the Malaysian body, but body politic as well. That is subtly haram. That is
Yes.
not halal anymore. And I think that is so much of the experience of being a modern Muslim anywhere, where guilt about not being the right kind of Muslim is so central to being a Muslim, and I don't think we talk enough about that guilt. That I think is quite defining to the whole experience of being a Muslim and experiencing Muslimness to begin with. And I doubt that you can actually get at it through intellectual means. You have to find some other artistic way to get at that particular guilt. But so you started Pusaka to kind of work with these communities to help sustain these indigenous practices, and then you also started a publishing house, Kala. Tell us about that. What did that come out from?
Well, Kala, basically, because I love the Malay language. I love it very much. It's one of the great worldly, dunyawi, and cosmopolitan languages in the world. It's made up of influences from everywhere: Sanskrit, Tamil, Urdu, Hindi, Portuguese. But it's been bureaucratized. Bureaucratized, brought into officialdom and formalized. And there's something I love about the Malay language, which is very enticing. The Malay language has this wonderful experience of not being caught up with time. There are no tenses in the Malay language.
Wow.
Right? So words in Shakespearean English, for example, because everything's caught up in tenses, even your diction gets affected, right?
Ah.
So you can sound very quaint or obsolete. Whereas in Malay, it has a timelessness, right? So part of my interest in entering into the Malay language, the world, the experience of the Malay language, and as I said, I don't write in it, I write in English, yeah, was through translation. And then, of course, there are many books I love. So, and everything that falls into Malay is even more beautiful in Malay than in the original language. I translated an American friend. I think you know him, Christopher Merrill.
I do.
I translated Chris, and we did a reading together. And midway through the reading, he said, "That sounds so deliciously beautiful, even more so than the English." But also, there was a political purpose. Because I'm trying to grapple with what happens with education
Right.
in the Malay language.
Right.
Because everything is prescribed for you. Yeah. And many of younger people, and this is the problem with culture too. One of my preoccupations is what happens to a culture when it is dislocated
Right.
from its origins, its history, its memory. But what happens to a generation who doesn't have that memory and history anyway? It's not dislocated from anything, right?
Right.
It's just alienated, completely alienated and conditioned. This was also happening in the Malay language. So the publishing house is actually partly an indulgence because I love Bilal, so I'll translate him into Malay. So that aspect, but it has this political dimension as well. I set it up with Pauline, who works with me, and she's of course reached brilliant heights now, translating from Malay into English. So it works all of that kind of way. But I hope you can get a sense of the kind of chaotic, eccentric ferment we all work in and with.
I think that gives us a great foundation to kind of talk about the second part of to get to the real question of this panel, right? I mean, I think you've also been involved in a lot of cultural exchange, right? Whether it's taking Malay ritual performers outside of Malaysia, whether it is bringing them into Malaysia. You and Pauline is Eden's partner, but also an extraordinary writer, a translator in her own right. Actually, one of my favorite essayists right now, who are writing right now. I mean, her essay on Paul Celan.
Yeah.
Is one of the most exquisite things I've read ever, and it's so extraordinary. So anyway, but I think that Eden and Pauline together, I think, are curators. They're cultural interlocutors. So how do you? So tell us a little bit about. We have gotten a good sense of your existing work, but tell us, how do you look at the world from that sort of vantage? When you sort of think about bringing people to Malaysia or taking people from Malaysia, what are the things that are going through your mind? What are the kind of conversations that you guys are having? What is important, what is not important? How should we curate this? What should we not do? What should we absolutely avoid?
Yes, we avoid anything that is constructed.
Okay,
I
that's
think everything too choreographed, anything too managed, But we fall back on what Malaysia essentially is. We are a seafaring country, yeah? Like so much of the rest of Asia. It has always been a polyglot place and always mongrelized place. I think yesterday we spoke a bit about terminology. And one of the reasons why I take a very overt stance about how we are defining ourselves, what kind of language we use. And part of my frustration is that, even as we think of Asia or for want of a better term, the non-Western world, now crumbling in so many ways, getting decadent in so many ways. Well, what's the alternative? And what have we actually created? I fall back a lot on history for this. When the first anti-colonial agitation, resistance was happening. It happened in the world of ideas.
Right.
And the legacy that was left by people like Tagore, by people like Okakura, people like Lu Xun in China, and in so many other places. Yeah,
Right.
I think we have failed. We have not created those channels of friendship, of bondage. 1975, 2025 is not only the 50th year of the Thriller in Manila, it's the 70th year of the Bandung
Bandung,
Conference,
yeah.
right? And what was Bandung trying to create? This is my neighbor,
Yeah.
With President Sukarno, Nehru, the Pakistanis were there. And I think we have completely failed because we've not been able to rationalize our politics. And in many ways, politically, we have worked ourselves into the framework
Yes.
created for us by the West.
Yeah.
And so I often think now of Marx's idea of Asiatic despotism. It seems to be what we eventually became,
Yes.
but it's not what we actually were.
Yeah.
All the mushawaras and all the, the culture, for example, of comparative religion
Right.
started in the Indian subcontinent, right? Of people getting down and talking ideas. Gandhi, for example, always insisted on having a journal of some kind.
Yeah.
Because without a journal, you cannot begin a movement.
Yeah.
Where's our journal to speak of?
Yeah.
And it's been how many years now? 70, 80, coming on 100 years.
Yeah.
But we're all into rivaling the production mechanisms and machines of the West
Yeah.
in our own societies.
No, I think that is the tragedy, right? I mean, that if I have to read a Malay author or if you have to read a Pakistani author, it has to be channeled through London or it has to be channeled through New York. Those publishing houses have to publish it. They have the onus of translating, of choosing, and again they will choose and translate based on whatever suits their vision or their needs of their primary audience, which is in the US or in the UK and so on. So so the question that I'm trying to drive at is that how do you see us overcoming that, or is that, and again it's perfectly fine to say that it's too much of a moonshot, like there is good reason why these connections don't exist anymore or they were not sustained. So they were started in the Bandung, and we talked about this yesterday, right? I mean, the governments were funding it and it was fine until CIA was funding it, but there is a reason why they did not sustain. Like these people don't want to talk to each other, they want to talk to the Americans or the Europeans and so on. What how would you sort of reflect on that?
We don't have we've not created a platform.
Yeah.
We don't even have a publication.
Yes.
It's perfectly fine. I think it's also very important to publish in the West.
Yeah.
Because that's part of the West's opening up too.
Yeah.
And there are specific publishing houses, for example, many of them located in the United States, actually, I think,
Yeah.
that are very radical,
Yeah.
very, very radical. And New Directions, for example,
Yes.
amazing in its worldliness.
Yeah.
And that's what I've always appreciated of the of the United States.
Yeah.
I'm very suspicious of binaries,
Yeah.
cultural binaries.
Yeah.
And so I'm not advocating that at all.
Yeah.
But I think power structures exist a lot in the centers of the world, publishing world, the centers of ideas. And I'm also quite ashamed, actually. I think there's been a lot of people who use that, exploit that, for their own social mobility, play to certain trends and tailor themselves in certain ways to be accepted by the West. So wokeism is not the solution to all of this stuff, but really a very intense interrogative dialogue between everybody. One of my great dreams, and I hope to see it realized in the next year, is to really start a journal. Maybe to be published 3 times a year at least, with a modest circulation, but to be sure that that journal hits the right spaces everywhere, East and West, because the voices have to come from here. And I think we have to be very, very conscious. And this is where I think Asia, our experience, and this includes Africa, has been very defeatist um, uh, in terms of leadership. And somehow, again, that theory of Asian despotism, was Mao one kind of Mao? No, Chairman Mao was about 3 or 4 or 5 different kinds of Chairman Mao. One of them was let thousand flowers bloom.
Right.
But we aren't able to sustain that, right? And then we clamp down in very oppressive and tyrannical ways.
Right.
But I think those things need to be interrogated and they need to be, it is a
So
democratization.
tell us a
of
little bit
kind.
more about the journal. Like, so help us envision, like, what is your vision of, this kind of a platform that can help bring the writers,
It's
thinkers.
voices.
Yeah.
It's my whole idea of everything is you don't be afraid of complications and complexities and eccentricities. You dive into them and you interrogate them. Small communities who have strange practices, they too defined an entire experience, right? We have to make the world as difficult as it is,
Yeah.
not simplify it, right?
That's a great
We
mission
have to.
statement.
We have to because
yeah.
it's not going to change. And if
Yeah.
it does change, then it's going to be very, very painful, and we will sacrifice a great deal because who wants to live in a world of sameness?
Right.
And we seem to be heading that way, essentialist worlds. That is what is disrupting everything in the world today, I think. So we have to create lots of little problems everywhere.
So how do you square that when you are, for example, curating a literary festival? How do you create Are you looking to create complications for your audience, or throw them into something that they don't understand? How I mean, I mean, I think you've spoken about this constantly, that we need to intellectualize culture, and I think that what you mean by that is that we should be able to articulate whatever we are doing, not in terms of flattening it, but to kind of really think about it in a complex and multifaceted way.
Yeah, I think you were at the Georgetown Literary Festival.
I was, yeah.
I know my Pauline is basically was director of it for 3 years and did a wonderful job.
Yeah.
Because she's full of grace, I'm full of huffing and puffing and bleeding from my ears. So she manages it. But I think you noticed that it was a very unique festival,
Yes.
built around a city in which aspects of history and memory literally fall into the festival.
Yeah.
The festival was very worldly, I think.
Yeah.
We got people from all over to speak on very abstruse sometimes topics.
Yeah.
And we didn't think of the literary only in people who wrote books. We got politicians, we
Yeah.
got people of that kind to really engage in ideas.
Yeah.
The problem with that, of course, that we have cretin leadership. You see. Literally barbarians who, or in the words of Werner Herzog, the great German filmmaker, funding agencies are full of bozos. And what happened was, of course, the bozos, and please publish this as widely as you can to Georgetown Literary Festival. The cretins and the barbarians and the bozos, of course, pulled out the funding. So it's not what it is anymore, and Pauline's no longer there. But when we think about it that way.
Right.
In fact, what is very interesting is that we just fall back on what the landscape that is hosting this festival. What is it all about? What is it historically? It's a mess, right? It's a mongrel place. Everybody fell here: Parsis, Gujaratis, Malayalis, Tamils, Chinese, indigenous Chinese, Malays from all over Indonesia, Europeans, the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese. So we be true to that now, right? And that is our ethos.
Right. No, I think that it's one of the best festivals that I have personally attended, and I think what was so refreshing, obviously, was to be able to engage with. I think that, as you said, so many voices, from all over Southeast Asia, South Asia, particularly. I mean, obviously, there were other people from Europe and other places, and fascinating, Australia. But you wanted to read something that is going to.
Maybe we could do that at the end.
Yeah, but I was thinking that maybe
We are going to end.
no, I think we can. You can maybe take like 5 to 10 minutes to read that, and then maybe we can open that
Okay,
up,
sure.
open it up for questions after that.
Yeah, talking about East and West and identity politics, and as I was growing up, as I said, I just kind of loved everything. One of the music that I love best is jazz. Hmm? And what is jazz? Jazz is instinct and impulse, and jazz is basically everything that falls rightly into place,
Beautiful.
and everything is improvised. And today I attended a wonderful session with Mariam, who wrote a marvelous book, and I'll keep praising it because it's so important in addressing the kinds of things I'm talking about. Giving paying due attention to parochialisms. I think that's very important. But the thing was, why do we read the classics? Is it
Yeah.
something of that kind?
Yeah.
Which to me is at once the most interesting topic and the most inane one at the same time. So I thought I'd read something about just passion, how something enters your life and how you hold on to it without ever thinking about where this come from. Because we are the world, no? So some years ago, I was asked to write a piece for a very fine publication in Malaysia and the region. It's actually a business weekly, and today I contribute a cultural column to it. It's a very fine publication. I'm not just saying it because I write for them. And they asked me to write something for New Year's Day.
Right.
New Year's Day, January 1st. And I thought of it and I said, okay, I'm going to write about the song Auld Lang Syne. Y'all know the song? Should all acquaintance be forgot? You don't sing it here? You know it?
No. Not
Okay, it's a
really.
very famous song
Right.
that is sung on New Year's Day.
Right.
It's all about remembrance. And it was composed by a very famous Scottish poet by the name of Robert Burns. And so I thought I'm going to write about that song and my experience of it. So this is Auld Lang Syne. They came in ordinary brown freight boxes, held together by brown masking tape. Just ordinary boxes, really, but which hid within them literally the world's treasures. A close friend of my father's, whose name was Thor Gimlock, Chinese man, or Uncle Gimlock to me, he was bald and straight-backed, deep-voiced, and always with a cigarette. And he worked at the Oxford University press offices in Kuala Lumpur. As shipments of that illuminating series, the Oxford World's Classics, arrived every few months, he would carefully set aside a box to bring them to me, a scrawny child with a touch of the inner wild, but always tentative when among people. Growing up in a new neighborhood, lyrically called Pantai Hills. Pantai Hills means coastal hills. It's a real oxymoron, coastal hills. Carved between the new popular township of Petaling Jaya, which means harmonious and prosperous, and the heart of the city of Kuala Lumpur, which means muddy estuary. Life for me was the vast outdoors, overgrown, craggy, snake-infested, with tadpole catching in the now submerged Damansara stream just down the road as a spot, or the deep interiors of my single room proverbially buried in books. I can still remember ripping the tape off the first book and discovering She by H. Rider Haggard, an adventure story apparently for boys. A decade later, we would discover a version of this adventurer, Horace Holly, its protagonist, in the form of an archaeologist called Indiana Jones. There were volumes also of a new series called the Classics of Asia series, which featured the tales of the great Malay hero Hang Tuah, carefully retold by an old colonial administrator who refused to leave, whose name was Mubin Shepherd, and the immortal love story from China of Lady Whitesnake. There was, of course, Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Books, which would later lend me my first literary archetype, Mowgli, the jungle wolf boy. Then there was especially the gasping Scotsman Robert Louis Stevenson, prone to pneumonia, who dreamt always of a tropical climate that would make breathing easier. And with that dream of good breath, unfurled the fantastical landscapes that would forge his classic novels and stories, Treasure Island and the South Sea Tales. My best love of his books, however, was Kidnapped. Set within the valleys of what was then for me the fabled city of Edinburgh, with its castle ruins, rebellions, and first clipped syllables that bore my very name. It was also my earliest introduction to what would prove a lifelong intellectual fascination, radical politics. The setting of Kidnapped, the aftermath of the Jacobite uprising, inspired a sense of keen discovery in me. Troubled even then that such an interest might bear the traces of a quaint colonialism, I reconciled in my head that loving the Scots was better than loving the English, and so retained to this very day a quaint partiality for Scottish independence. This trail of discovery was to lead to a deep search of Scottish history through the pages of that greatest educator, the Encyclopedia Britannica, a discovery of Macbeth, and finally to the histrionic figure of the poet Robert Burns. This mythic figure of everything Scotland has suffered the fate of most myths, a deflation of real meaning and a mutation into national sentimentality. Even today, the real radicalism of Burns would spark contentious debate. Born in Alloway, in Ayrshire, Burns, the son of a tenant farmer, grew to his radicalism watching his father being beaten by authority. His radical ideas burned with the onset of the French Revolution and its promise of liberty, equality, fraternity. His poetry ranged from sloganeering to the tender and created a poetic personality of such complexity that he has since become just about everything to everyone. Or in the words of one of his own songs, man is complicated. Yet this maze through the Britannica and the labyrinth that is Scotland, Robert Burns struck home when I discovered that the song, Auld Lang Syne, long regarded as a family anthem at every whiskey-driven New Year's Eve, here and everywhere, was put together by the very same Robert Burns. Declared by the BBC as an international anthem and Scotland's greatest gift to the world, Burns' Auld Lang Syne, a song of the deepest sadness, longing, and dreams of reconciliation, was brought by the Scottish immigrants throughout the diaspora, especially to the regions of North America. It is rumored that in the American Civil War, the general of the Unionist armies, Ulysses Grant, restrained the song from being sung by his cavalry, for its theme of home and return would bring about homesickness. But upon victory, he ordered the band to play it as a symbol of hope and healing. By the 20th century, the song had become a recurrent theme for renewal in silent cinema, used most poignantly by Charlie Chaplin in the New Year scene of the film The Gold Rush. Closer to home, to Malaya, a striking recollection by Anthony Burgess in his brilliant memoir, Little Wilson and Big God, of a drunken New Year's Eve night in Kota Baru, a small town in the northeast of Malaysia, overlooking the Kelantan River, a state in the northeast of Malaysia, on the eve of a Malaya headed for independence, and with his great novel, The Clockwork Orange, looming, has loud voices in the background announcing departure by singing Auld Lang Syne. I think that the reader should enrich what he is reading. He should misunderstand the text. He should change it into something else. The greatest of our readers and one of the greatest of our writers, Jorge Luis Borges, once said, And this is how the misunderstanding of Burns's Scotland and Auld Lang Syne takes place. I am 5 and 6 and 7, in the midst of a swirl of bodies, also driven over a little by whiskey. We are mimicking a Scottish dance step. My gentle uncles are, in this instance, slightly boisterous. We have struck the turn of year. It is my beautiful mother's birthday. An uncle's hand reaches down and hoists me over his shoulder, and the song begins. Should all acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? This is one of my clearest memories, this sense of great height.
Thank you, Eden. I think that that essay and all the connections sort of it pulled, and how it first centers Robert Burns and then decenters him, and sort of the spread of ideas and how you've kind of traced those ideas all over the world. I think that that's a great sort of model for how, I don't know how to say, I mean, it's not even a model. I think that is, I think, the ethos that can serve all of us in our intellectual and spiritual journeys, particularly for us in the East, because I think that loosening up, that opening up, I think allows for those connections to form. Are there any questions from the audience that we can take? There is a question here, please.
Hello. As you talked about, you are a political being, right? So, I would like to know about the landscape, political landscape of Southeast Asia, specifically Malaysia. What are the political drivers there? Just like in Pakistan, those political drivers are deep state, the religion, the feudalism. So these are the political drivers here in the Pakistan. So what are the political drivers in the Southeast Asia and in Malaysia?
Pretty much the same thing. I think it's what dominates politics everywhere now. Essentially, very subliminal forces of ideology, of real state of unease about how much complication we bring with us. And so this need for essentialism and a need for puritanism and a need for essentially being as simple as you could possibly be. I think in that way, democracy has also not served us well. And I think really every political being is petrified of his self and herself. And a lot of, I think, how we reach out for politics is rooted in fear.
So Eden, I mean, I think that the underlying question that I have from there is that, I mean, the place that you want, that you go to as a thinker, as an artist, as a writer, is a place of messiness, is a place where where you cannot have easy answers. How do you think that that is a productive place for global connections, for establishing, for reaching out to a broader community, to the global south, to third world? Because I think that the obvious answer seems to be that actually it's, as Thomas Friedman says, have McDonald's franchises and then speak in the language of McDonald's, because that, you guys are now speaking in the same language of trade, of international commerce. But I think what you have been advocating and what you've been an advocate of, and I think what I've been trying to sort of bring out, is that you've been advocating something quite the opposite, right? Which is messiness, which is actually difference. But again, how do you square that with the sense of like then being able to even speak to the other?
I'm glad you brought up the name of Thomas Friedman. One of the great tragedies of the world is that we listen to him too much. And I think all that, global trade, the McDonaldization of the world,
Yeah.
That has brought about this kind of, chaos because it's hegemonic.
Yeah.
It's not trade like we knew it in Indian Ocean trade, okay? Capitalism, of which I'm a great advocate, but of very old forms of capitalism. Commodification is corporatization is a totally different beast altogether. Let me try and put a political projection that is at once cultural. I think nations, smaller nations, like Malaysia, like the Southeast Asian region, like the Caribbean, are going to have a lot more to say. They are resource-rich countries. One of the countries that has the highest GDP today is in the Caribbean, in Guyana, which is led by a marvelous Muslim prime minister, very articulate, very intelligent, big fan of Bob Marley, you can't go wrong. And I think because of the nature of our heterogeneity, we will have a lot of opportunities to provide a compass of how the world works through this very rigid place it's gotten itself into. And that will have to take cultural features. This may be very romantic, but I think we don't have any other way. We're going to have to go through a period of very deep struggle, maybe even violence, before that begins to comes to the fore. But I think it eventually will. So I think we have to prepare ourselves. I do believe in disruption and subversion. Because I don't think there's really a point of arrival. Right? And that's the great mistake of our past so many decades, right? And I think it was well encapsulated by Francis Fukuyama, who's a marvelous writer, and I found his book invigorating. But the end of history, really? Who are you, God? So I think these continued disruptions are very, very important. Life, my brother, is a process. It has no end. I remember one of the things that had been a great influence on me. I met him eventually, and this is the poet Derek Walcott. Not a very nice man, not a very nice man at all. And I was able to get on with him because I knew a lot about cricket. So that itself also is a strategy, right? How you deal with individuals of this kind. But he said a wonderful thing, in his Nobel lecture, when he talked about the Caribbean
Yeah.
as being polyglot,
Yeah.
mongrelized,
Yeah.
a landscape without a history,
Yes.
like heaven.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was so much about how I reflected on my place. I mean, I'm a small person from a small country. What can we actually do? But that's really not the point. No person is small, really. No country is small if what you say has enough resonance.
Yeah.
So I think that is my optimism. At every stage, there is greater pessimism than optimism. At every stage, yeah. And I'm naturally despairing all the time. I don't know if you know the Romanian philosopher Emil Cioran.
No.
He writes all these very depressing books, The Trouble with Being Born and things like that. And I'm a great fan of his. But I think when you are deeply rooted in ritual theater and when you see people, after hearing a certain kind of mantra, or when you sit down in the feet of kawals, yeah, Mayor and Chair Ali are my adopted fathers. Yeah, we brought them to Kuala Lumpur many times. And when they sing Man Kunto Maula, as I heard the other day by the Farid Ayaz, I mean, there's a whole your soul just is uplifted. So I fall back on those things
Yeah.
in a very romantic way.
Yeah.
But just as I weep whenever I hear Auld Lang Syne because I think of my dead uncles and I think of my mother. That kind of emotional power surges you forward.
I think we are out of time. Thank you all. Eden is available. You guys can come up and ask him questions. But thank you all for coming and taking out your time for being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you, Eden.
touched.
Thank you. Thank you so much.